Hello, I'm Randy Kearns, and I'm your professor for Management 4450 and 5450. This week is week 3, disasters and emerging infectious diseases. So a couple of things that I want to be sure and go over before I get into the presentation. Again, your assignments this week. We have 3 independent study courses that are through FEMA that are certificates that we need to complete. I recognize some of you struggled with IS 235, the assignment due last week. Just understand that was far more comprehensive than these particular certificates. But I can't encourage you enough to spend just a little bit of time getting comfortable with the material. And again, once you get the hang of the system and once you get the feel for, what is a logical solution, what's a logical answer, you'll get a feel for what you need to be doing and how quickly you can move through it. Incident command is important. Incident command is one of the key concepts of how we manage command and control function at a site of an event. The introduction to exercises helps you understand how we plan for exercise activity, from something as simple as a tabletop exercise or scenario-based exercise to either a full-scale or a functional exercise. And then your last certificate that's due this week is Incident Command 200, which is basically a build on to IS 100. There's actually an IS 300 and a 400. We won't cover those as a part of this program, but 100 and 200 give you the basic principles of how we use incident command and the basic functions of incident command on any emergency management type activity. And then other topics or other components of the course for this week. Emerging infectious diseases, that will be the presentation. I'll go over the basics for that shortly. I will say, before I get into that too much, just understand that if you look at the entire presentation, that's something that I wrote for the State Department and that we provide for an international audience. The only part I'm going to cover, and the only part that's a part that you will find questions on the quiz, will come from the first chapter. So I would focus on the first chapter of emerging infectious diseases. The rest of the material's there, and certainly you're welcome to review as much of that content as you like. But the overview of emerging infectious disease is found in chapter 1, and that's where the questions come from that's on the quiz. And then the discussion forum that's due this week, there are a couple of different choices you have. If you'll review one of the articles related to LEs, and LE is an end-of-life event or an extinction level event. Just understand there have been several LEs that have occurred on the planet over the last several billion years. And it is important to understand how those things occur, how that really resets life as it is known on the planet, and what types of challenges that would pose. As we continue to evolve with technology and understanding our place in the universe, hopefully we'll also understand ways that we can avoid any type of potential disaster like that in the future. But it is important for you to at least understand how these things have happened in the past. Or you can read the article, 20 Biggest Man-Made Disasters, and discuss one of those. And I also include a list of LEs from a Wikipedia site. I'm not a big fan of Wikipedia, but Wikipedia is, if nothing else, a large collection of information that's generally verifiable. Okay, without anything further, let me pause this just a moment. So I'm going to pause the recording and pull up the presentation. Okay, so let's go ahead and pivot to emerging and old infectious disease. And what we want to talk about here, again, this is a long presentation that we developed for the State Department. The last time I delivered it was last year in Turkey for um, um, actually Iraqis and Kurds. And so the whole point to this was to, again, just take kind of an overview and look at both infectious disease from, from a naturally occurring event, as well as how infectious diseases, and particularly how they have been weaponized and can become biological agents uh, and lead to some type of a catastrophic event, um, and what are things that we need to look for. So we also, just a part of this presentation, we'll talk about some of the key pieces of what makes an infectious disease particularly deadly or virulent, or how does it, what types of infectious vectors are there, what's the most common vector that transmits the disease, and then obviously talk about, I'm not going to talk a lot about treatment protocols or protective equipment. In this setting, the main thing I want you to know is, again, just that general awareness of what's the difference between the different types of infectious diseases that we would be more likely to deal with or face. So the CDC has category A and B agents. Just to talk a little bit about the difference between an infectious disease and a zoonotic disease. So anything that's caused by a pathogenic microorganism is an infectious disease. And typically, typically these pass from, well, so if they pass from human to human, that is in and of itself an infectious disease. A zoonotic disease are when diseases of animals can lead to transmission of diseases in humans, or be transmitted to humans. And the best example we have of that is COVID-19. COVID-19 is known in the scientific world as SARS coronavirus 2. And SARS coronavirus 2 was first identified in the same genomic sequence today in 2011, 2012, in a bat species in a lab in Wuhan, China. Again, there's been all sorts of wild speculation about it escaped from a lab or it was weaponized. We know through genomic sequencing that the same virus that exists today and was present in Wuhan in fall of December of 2019 is the same virus that was seen in the bat population and written about 2011, 2012. And so we know that at some point it made a zoonotic jump from bats to humans. Actually, there are dozens of influenza viruses that are commonly found in avian host in birds. But very few of them have made the zoonotic transfer from birds to human. And so, and the whole thing is, again, just understandable from the fact of there are lots of diseases that are endemic in different types of animal species, but don't necessarily jump to humans. But when they do, and when they're particularly deadly or infectious, it does lead to what we define as a worldwide pandemic. And we'll talk about the definition of a pandemic shortly, but that's certainly obviously the case we're in right now. And any disease that's easily spread from human to human is also described as a communicable disease. So we really want to talk about both the four types of infectious from a virus to a bacterium to a parasite to a fungi. So let's go back to a virus. Really tiny organism. We typically associate a virus with things like influenza, measles, hepatitis, yellow fever, West Nile virus. Just understand that viruses are not affected by antibiotics. We have very few antivirals, and what works on one virus doesn't work on another. Our best defense against viruses is identifying the virus and developing a vaccine. In some cases, it's pretty easy to develop a vaccine. In some cases, it's not. Measles and mumps, as an example. Once we understood the structure of measles and mumps, it was pretty easy for us to develop a vaccine even 40 years ago when those vaccines were developed. As we've become far more capable of understanding the sequencing, the development of the virus, it's a lot easier for us to recognize what viruses are easier for us to develop either effective treatments for, or to at least be able to, in some cases, minimize the effect of the virus, or in many cases to develop a vaccine. The Ebola virus, we tend to think that we have a pretty effective vaccine for it. Hepatitis B, we have a very good vaccine for it. I've been vaccinated for hepatitis B. HIV, we've not been able to develop an effective vaccine, but the big difference is we've been able to develop very effective treatments. In 1986, 1987, when HIV was first fairly prominent in a number of communities, once you were diagnosed with HIV, you were basically told you've got about 6 months to get your affairs in order, and your life expectancy was anywhere from 6 months to a year. That's 1996. So let's fast forward to today in 2021. If you're diagnosed with HIV today, as long as it's caught early, and as long as you're prescribed appropriate meds and you take your meds on a regular basis, it does not progress, and you can live an otherwise healthy, long, and productive life. So even though we've not developed a way to vaccinate against HIV, and we've not developed a means to completely eradicate it from the body as of yet, I think that day will come. We've developed very effective treatments, and it was actually some of those effective treatments with HIV that's helped us with coronavirus. I've also got adenovirus and influenza here. Just adenovirus and influenza and coronavirus are the three most common viruses that lead to the types of head colds and lung infections and sinus infections that we deal with each year. Some are, and there's a whole family of coronaviruses that typically aren't dangerous. SARS-CoV-1 first emerged in 2003, very deadly, very dangerous, but we've not seen it since. And that's why we hoped coronavirus 2, when it first emerged in fall of 2019, that maybe it would also be cyclical, maybe it would be climate sensitive, maybe it would be temperature sensitive, and it would go away like SARS coronavirus 1 did. It did not. So anyway, but that's the virus family. With a bacterium or a bacteria, and I've got a chart in a minute that that also help sort these out just a little bit. A bacterium is a single cell organism. Just understand that a virus requires a host, and a bacterium, a single bacterium is one cell. Multiple cells of the same bacterium is referred to as bacteria. That's the plural of bacteria. And just understand that we have lots of antibiotics that allow us to treat people with some type of a bacterial infection. And there are several more notable communicable diseases that are bacterial in nature: cholera, Legionnaire's disease, typhoid, tetanus, TB. Again, because we have lots of very effective treatments for bacterial infections, as long as we catch it early, in most cases, and as long as the body has a robust autoimmune system, we can use antibiotics and treat patients effectively and clear up the problem and move on. It was one of the last great worldwide pandemics. 1347 to 1351 killed over half of the European population. Yersinia pestis, also known as the bubonic plague, or also known as the Black Death of the 1350s, that was substantial in nature, and it gave way to helping us understand communicable disease. And that was some of the early opportunities for us to understand communicable disease. And actually, some of the public health measures we still use today in terms of physical distancing and what are things that we can do to control the spread of infectious disease were taken from things that we understood back in the 1350s in the aftermath of the Black Plague or the Black Death. We didn't fully understand it at that time. We have a far better understanding of it today. But I can tell you, again, a lot of those same really simple public health measures that we used then, that we used in the 1918 flu pandemic, continue to be effective today. And that includes good hygiene, physical distancing, some type of a face covering when you're around others, and just understand how communicable disease works. The two other types of infectious disease I won't spend a lot of time on because they're far less deadly, although they can be. One's a parasitic type of disease. Parasites are organisms that live off of a host. And there are some parasite examples that I've used, but again, malaria is probably the more common of those. But because of the environment in which we live today, parasites, at least in a Western setting, parasites are not a huge risk to us. Now, if you wind up in an austere environment, if you wind up in certain third world countries, serving in a variety of roles, you could wind up with a parasite exposure, and then obviously if you do wind up, I've been to several third world countries, and they wound up writing a prescription for me to take with me as an anti-parasitic if I did contract one of those diseases. And then a fungus, again, a single cell is a fungi. The plural of that is a fungus. And then understanding how that interacts with the human body. And again, the plural of fungus is fungi. And the whole point of the fungal infection is just understanding the fact that there are not a lot of infectious diseases out there that are fungal in nature that can be deadly. Again, it is important to recognize that any type of infectious disease needs to be treated, needs to be managed accordingly, but we also have antifungals that we can manage fairly easily. So again, if we're our two primary means of a communicable disease is either by virus or bacteria. With a virus, the best means of management is through vaccines. We have some antivirals, but we have very few. And in most cases, the intent of the antiviral is to limit the development of symptoms or managing symptoms. We're far more likely to do a better job, and even today in dealing with COVID. There's no effective cure for COVID. There's symptom management and vaccines, and that's normal for any virus. It's normal for COVID. Sometimes there was a time that we got caught up in debating hydroxychloroquine. The best point I can make about hydroxychloroquine is again, if we look back in the research to 2005, we recognized in 2005 that hydroxychloroquine had some effective use in SARS coronavirus 1. And so theoretically, we hoped it may be effective in treating some symptoms in SARS coronavirus 2. And the science didn't pan out, and obviously we moved on from it, but at some point it took a political turn, and if you supported former President Trump, he thought it was a great idea. I'm not exactly sure why, but that seemed to be the fixation. And if you didn't like President Trump, you seemed to think it was a terrible idea. I would encourage you to understand the science around it, and the science to this point is hydroxychloroquine is not an effective treatment for SARS coronavirus 2. If it is, we use it. If it's not, we don't use it, and let the politicians figure out whatever the politicians want to do. That's not a big deal, or it should not be a big deal. But again, as far as viruses go and bacteria goes, our best solution in managing a virus is a vaccine, and our best solution in managing bacteria, first of all, is to avoid it, but we have a number of antibiotics that we can use to manage bacterial infections. The virus is much smaller in size than the bacteria. A virus is also, it's non-cellular in nature, in the fact that it requires a host. It invades a host, takes over the cell, and causes it to make copies of the viral DNA. And it's also non-living. The challenge with that is there are times that we don't know how long viruses can be inactive and yet be reactivated. And so let me give you an example. When you hear about the ice caps melting at the South Pole or at the North Pole, you know, regardless of what you think about climate change, whether you think that's naturally occurring or that's man-made, or let's set that aside just a moment, just to understand that as thousands of years have been locked away in ice, as that begins to melt and that's now exposed to the atmosphere and potentially exposed to people who may be doing research in those areas, we may be reactivating viruses that we've not seen in the human population in thousands of years, maybe ever. And so, you know, that's always the concern about viruses. Now with bacteria, they're living organisms. If you can kill it with cold, then it's dead and it's not going to be reactivated. The single biggest threat to man's continued dominance of the planet is the virus. That was said in 1958. That's true today. And the best way to understand how quickly a virus can bring the world to its knees is just to look at COVID-19. And COVID-19, to be quite honest, is deadly. Has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. but as a portion of the population is not as deadly as the 1918 flu pandemic. And so, you know, it certainly serves as a warning as to how bad things can be. But as bad as it's been, it obviously could have been a lot worse. I say that I've had 16 members of either my family or friends that I've known through the years who have died from COVID. So obviously it's a terrible disease and it's a terrible situation. But again, as a percentage of the total population, it's not been as deadly as the 1918 flu pandemic. It has been deadlier than anything else we've dealt with in the last 100 years, but not as bad as the 1918 flu pandemic. And with that, let me show you just some pictures from the 1918 flu pandemic. Most hospitals were overwhelmed almost immediately. They developed these emergency hospitals, somewhat similar to what you see down at what you saw down at the convention center. These temporary hospitals were erected. And the difference is during the flu pandemic of 1918, somewhere between 5 and 20% of the entire world population died during the pandemic. Obviously, COVID's not going to be that bad. It's still bad. And so if you're looking for the definition of a pandemic, this is actually out of a textbook chapter that I wrote that published in 2014. What is a pandemic? How are they? Pandemic includes an infection that's spread person to person, so it's a communicable disease. Most of the population is susceptible. There's not a lot of natural immunity, just as right now we don't have natural immunity to COVID-19 because it's never been seen in the human population. And we've historically thought, because influenza viruses are easier to mutate than adenovirus or coronavirus, we really thought we would see the next pandemic out of an influenza virus. Now, there is a small advantage to it being in a coronavirus. Coronaviruses don't mutate as fast as influenza virus. Now, you know, obviously we're concerned about the coronavirus mutations, but just understand that once influenza virus is in the human population, it's a lot easier for it to mutate than it is for coronavirus or adenovirus. Anyway, and this is, again, just giving you an idea of the different types of disease. I've done a lot of international traveling over the last several years to countries that don't necessarily have some of the same healthcare standards as we do here in the United States. Turkey, the other countries in the Middle East, India, China, and when I've gone to those countries, the other thing that I'll do is look to the State Department guidance for what type of vaccines I need to take or what type of therapies I need to take with me in case I'm exposed to something. And this does give you an idea of, even though many of these things aren't common here in the US, tuberculosis is far less common in the US than it is in some countries. Malaria, far less common. Dengue fever, far less common. You know, but it's there. It is important to think in terms of emerging infectious disease as a threat for biological attack. How do you take something that's either a virus or a bacteria and weaponize it in a way that it could hurt or put at risk significant portions of the population? You know, most of you remember the 9/11 attacks. Just understand that that occurred on September the 11th. I think it's October the 12th was the first of the anthrax letters that showed up. Again, there's a lot of focus on the international and foreign terrorism associated with the 9/11 attacks. Just understand the anthrax letters, that was a homegrown attack. That was another American sending anthrax weaponized grade anthrax through the mail to purposefully kill other people, and did kill, I think, 8, 9 people, but certainly scared, scared a lot of us, and led to substantial investment in systems to help us sort through, again, weaponized version of infectious disease. It is important to be able to distinguish between what is a purposeful release of an infectious disease and what's an accidental release. One of the early on pieces of COVID was genomic mapping and trying to understand what the genomic sequence was of SARS coronavirus 2. Once we understood that it was an exact match of something that we had seen in the bat population in 2011, 2012, had been published and was in several journals, we understood at that point it was a zoonotic jump. It had moved from the animal world to the human world, and that's a natural occurrence that occurs. You can also tell through sequencing if somebody has used something like CRISPR and genetically altered and weaponized a virus, which would be a really bad thing. Again, we can sequence it, we understand it, we know where it came from, and it did come from a bat. So it does tell us it's naturally occurring, but maybe the next pandemic is a biological attack, and that is why we do investigate those things to the extent that we do. Somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of all of the deaths worldwide occur due to an infectious disease, and it does help us understand that infectious diseases do claim significant numbers of lives each year. Now, it's far more likely to occur in countries other than the Western civilization, which has a more modern style of medicine. But it's also important to recognize how these transitions, or how these infections occur. I've broken it down into first transition, second transition, third, and then fourth transition. And what I'm talking about there is how does it move? How does it expose other people? What are things that we do to put ourselves at risk, and what are things that we do to keep ourselves safe? First of all, just inventing an indoor toilet, the types of things that we do. And I have to also remind you that our idea of an indoor toilet is something that we just assume everybody has. Just having traveled in other countries, just understand that this is not the same type of toilet that everybody uses. Our idea of hygiene in the United States is not what everybody assumes is good hygiene. And for that matter, I would also tell you that our practice of hygiene in America is not as good as it is in some countries, which also to me explains why our mortality rate is as high as it is with COVID-19. Second transition, again, neighboring civilizations. Third transition is this worldwide exploration. And that's part of the challenge we have with germs today, is how quickly something can move from one continent to another, just simply because of how interconnected the world is. If you think about the number of people that fly through the world's airports, and certainly connected either New York Kennedy or Atlanta Hartsfield or Chicago O'Hare or LAX, there's more than a dozen international flights that used to come into New Orleans each day before the pandemic. So it's not unrealistic to understand that whatever began somewhere else is either going to come here, or if it was here, that it goes somewhere else. And then the fourth transition is what's happening today. Again, the globalization and the global urbanization, how population density allows us to quickly spread and and share infectious diseases. See if there's anything else here that I want to be sure and cover today. I do include some things to interspecies transfer. Again, when I talk about a zoonotic disease, that's what I'm talking about, something that transfers from the animal world to humans specifically as a part of the animal world. There are hurdles to interspecies transfer. But if we come back to our primary conclusion is this, just understand the sources of infection. That will be important for your quiz. What are the historical transmission vectors? What are infection vectors? And then again, if you have some time, I would encourage you to, again, spend a little bit of time looking at the rest of the presentation. The big picture is this, you know, understand the four types, again, the sources of infection, the four primary sources of infection, and particularly focus on virus and bacteria, and understand how those types of infections can challenge us and challenges us today and will continue to challenge us in the future. Again, the answer to, if it's a viral infection, the best solution is really vaccination. If it's a bacterial infection, our best solution is antibiotics, and we continue to develop robust antibiotics. Again, just remember, bacterium are single cell, and so it's easier for us to develop something to destroy that. Virus requires a host, and because it's not living, it can be activated or reactivated. It's more challenging to deal with the virus, so it's easier to prevent the virus through vaccines. Anyway, with that, let me wrap up for today. Again, if you have questions, let me know. Take the quiz on this. Be sure and do your discussion thread, and do your complete your three certificates this week. And that's it. And until next Monday at 4 o'clock, I'll see you on Zoom at that time. Otherwise, I hope you have a good Mardi Gras.